So, despite all the complaints about Modern Horizons 2 into the Modern format, Modern is still going on super strong. The qualifier for the Pro Tour in Copenhagen is going to be Modern, the Raga format, as some people say. And who better to invite to have a check-in on what's good and what's not than the Arena Decklist podcast hosts themselves? Gerry Thompson, one of the fairest people in Magic, and the creator of Mardu Pyromancer, one of the most beloved decks, and Bryan Gottlieb, the fandom legend himself, and a recent great addition to the Flesh and Blood community. Welcome to the Cardmarket YouTube channel.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This is awesome.
I love that very generous introduction, Carl. It's been a moment since I took down the Fandom Legend series, but I did take it down, and nobody better forget that ever.
We remember it dearly.
Thank you.
But listen, I call you guys over today because some people are getting back into Modern. The qualifiers this summer are going to be Modern in Copenhagen. So a lot of people are going to want to check in and find out what's good, what to beat, how to beat them. So I asked you guys to provide a top 5 list of the decks to beat in the format. Now you agreed on a lot of things, but your number 5 slot, you don't at all. Now, Gerry, you said that the number 5 slot for you was Golgari Yawgmoth, while Bryan, you said Amulet Titan. Now, we're going to have a fight over this. Not a violent fight because we're TCG players. Gerry, would you like to explain first why you think this is the 5 slot?
It's weird because once you get into the kind of like middle of the pack in the format, you're kind of splitting hairs, really. Like, there are so many decks that are very good in specific metagames, not very good in others. And oddly, I'm kind of in the Yawgmoth camp now, whereas Bryan was a defender of this deck before. Obviously, Bryan is like longtime Amulet fan also, but I actually think that Yawgmoth has gotten a lot stronger because people have upgraded the deck, they've tuned it a little bit more, and it's gotten a little bit more robust and powerful. They have better sideboard plans and things like that, and I think that the matchup spread is also just pretty good. So I think right now is a pretty decent time to be playing Yawgmoth if you like that sort of intricate creature combo type of deck.
All right, and Bryan, you say number 5 is Amulet Titan. Do you think the channel lands didn't hurt it too much, or did they make it better? Why is it on the number 5 instead of Yawgmoth?
Well, I know it makes way better YouTube content if I come out here and trash Gerry's pick and I say Golgari Yawgmoth is completely unplayable and Gerry has no idea what he's talking about. But I think these two decks are so close. I just as easily could have had Golgari Yawgmoth in my 5 slot. It's a deck I've played a lot, a deck I like a lot, and Gerry's assessment feels spot on to me. I just think Amulet is more linearly powerful. It is always going to be able to do its thing regardless of what the format is, short of like really heavy Blood Moon formats. That's where it gets a little scary for Amulet, but almost any other metagame, it's going to have some play because the thing it does is just so powerful and so consistent for the Modern format. It's so good at just putting that Primeval Titan into play on turn 2, turn 3, and from that point, the game is often very rudimentary. It's very easy to proceed. There's many options available to you if you know your deck very well. So part of my affinity for this archetype is based on the fact that I've just played it forever. I have it in all foil, which obviously dramatically influences my decision. But I don't think the gap between Golgari Yawgmoth and Amulet is all that large, and either one is a fine choice for your next Modern tournament.
All right, but now I know these are 2 different decks, but could each of you guys give me kind of a quick business card version of how you would come prepared for these decks and how you beat them?
I mean, part of why I have Yawgmoth so high is because it is very difficult to beat for the decks that I enjoy playing, which are usually those removal heavy decks. So it's like you play against it once or twice, you kind of get a feel for what the deck is capable of doing, and then it's just like the 5th, 6th, 7th time they beat you and it just feels completely hopeless. And I think that the reason for that is that there aren't a lot of popular sideboard cards that are good against it, but if you have like any sort of exiling removal, if you have, I mean, this is part of the problem too, where it's like you could play Cage to stop Court of Calling or Eldritch Evolution or whatever, and the Undying creatures, but then maybe they still beat you with Grist, or they just beat you with like Yawgmoth anyway, or you try to Rest in Peace them or something, and they still kind of just like beat you down with random creatures. So I don't know, it's just you have to play a deck that is fundamentally strong against it versus like, oh, what specific cards do you look at to try and fight this matchup?
So I'm assuming what you mean is just have a more proactive game plan, be faster, kind of. Is that it?
More or less. I mean, I think that Amulet, I think, is a good example of this, where it's kind of a proactive, generally goldfishing around turn 3 to maybe not set up a kill, but a virtual kill where you're almost certainly going to kill them on the next turn. Maybe like the Calibrated Blast combo decks that are now kind of popping up with the weird 50-mana Death Shadow, stuff like that.
All right, and Brian, you have Primeval Titan. You did mention Blood Moon, but in general, if you think your meta and maybe at your FNM has a lot of people playing Primetime, they've been playing it forever, they're very good at it, how do you come prepared?
Yeah, well, start with Blood Moon. I mean, that's the kind of the cheat code, right? Unfortunately, not many decks in the format are able to leverage Blood Moon right now. And I say unfortunately, but maybe it's fortunately. I don't really love when Blood Moon's a huge focus of the metagame. But there are always good land destruction tools available. It's just that sometimes Primeval Titan is able to play through them and just blunt force through them. So, adding stuff like Boseiju to your deck, it helps, but also these Amulet Titans are going to pick up Boseiju and be able to counter whatever you're doing to stop them. So I think that, again, what you're supposed to do to counteract Amulet is find ways to ignore it. And that's a lot harder when a deck is presenting that turn 3, turn 4 clock consistently. There are decks in the format that are faster. If you're taking a control route, you have to be very, very well-rounded. You need to be able to answer Primeval Titan. You need to be able to answer lands, otherwise Cavern of Souls can doom you. Hat to Exile is another card that, if it's not present, just like Yawgmoth can prey on sorcery speed removal being the kind of removal du jour, I think Amulet can do the same. So moving back to some more instant speed interaction is good. Playing those mana base inclusions, things like Ghost Quarter, Tectonic Edge, whatever you need to do to just slow down their progression a little bit. And then the key is you have to seize the momentum at that part. It's not enough to stop Amulet Titan because they do have inevitability on their side. A lot of deck searching. You need to be moving forward with your own game plan as well.
All right. Now, one thing you guys did agree on is number 4 on our list, which is Azorius Hammer. Would one of you guys like to walk me through why it's so strong right now?
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, again, proactivity. Since Modern's inception, you're often rewarded by figuring out what is the best way to just kind of ignore your opponent and blow them up. From the beginning, it's been a format about 2 ships passing in the night. Now that's changed a little bit with the addition of Modern Horizons 2. The free spells, there are more ways to interact. So as opposed to just going complete aggro, ignore my opponent, smash their face in with the hammer, you want to find some ways of instilling resiliency in your deck. And as time goes on, I find Azorius Hammer gets better and better at doing that, be it the addition of the reality chip from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which allows them to play a little bit longer game. Even things like the Stoneforge Mystic package. I'm not going to say the deck benefited in getting away from Lurrus, because Lurrus was a huge inevitability tool. But opening up things like playing Caldera Complete, the stronger, sort of Fire and Ice, or whatever sword War and Peace you think is appropriate for the metagame, you now have access to that. You don't have to limit your casting costs so aggressively. So it's a little bit of the old school of Modern, where you just blow your opponent out of the water, and a little bit of the new school, where it finds cheap interaction and just is able to keep presenting that game plan over and over and over across multiple turns.
If you're expecting to get the the Azorius Hammer decks in your metagame, how do you come prepared? What do you bring to beat them?
Ooh, unlike Yawgmoth, this deck is actually kind of easy to hate out, because there are a lot of powerful cards, things like Kolaghan's Command, for example, where you have 2 very clean answerable hits with that almost always. Having a thing that can attack Urza Saga or Sigarda's Aid are definitely nice. So the White March, that one is very versatile, very nice against the variety of threats that Hammer has, because they're attacking you with the land, they're attacking you with maybe an enchantment, maybe an equipment, maybe some Pure Steel Paladin that's going to draw them a decent amount of cards. So having versatile removal like that is good. Having just cheap answers too, where if you are on more of a fair strategy, you need to be interacting usually from turn 1. So the Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt type of stuff, Prismatic Ending, March, Solitude, all that stuff is great against them. And then if you have those versatile white cards, or you want to dip into Kolaghan's Command, be like a Grixis Mage with a tier 3 deck, which I love, then you can definitely do that. So if you're loading up on things like Kolaghan's Command or Prismatic Endings, whatever, I think you're going to have a pretty good time against them. And that's like one of the few decks in the format that I can say that about, where there is just a plethora of available hate cards against them that you can play if you want to.
Yeah, you're right that artifacts are famously kind of easy to hate out after board. But now we've gone to number 3, and in this case we can't do number 3 without doing number 2 at the same time, because you agree on the number 3 and 2 decks, but you don't agree the order in which they come in. Now, Brian, you put Living End just a notch higher than Is It Murktide, which is kind of a crowd favorite right now. Would someone like to go first as to why they think Living End or Murktide goes before the other?
Yeah, like I said, the list is kind of splitting hairs because all these decks are very, very good, and certainly in the matchups that they're great against, like they're awesome there. It's just all about trying to line things up well. And I think for the last couple weeks, Living End has done supremely well on Magic Online, and that hasn't been a result of the deck getting better or anything. Like, there haven't been many new reprints. Colossal Sky Turtle added like a little bit of versatility, Odawara also. But even when those cards came out, the deck didn't immediately start doing well. So it was more about it being good thanks to some metagame shifts and people maybe cutting like their Cascade hate cards a little bit too. So I think that Living End definitely had 2 very good weeks. I think that its time is kind of fading again as people re-add those cards to their decks. And Is It Murktide is just a very, very solid all-arounder, and it's almost certainly always going to have a place in the top 5 somewhere.
As a bit of an aside, because the game plan is not exactly the same, but somewhat similar, you have Living End here, but you don't have Timur Rhinos anywhere in the top 5, or even with honorable mentions. Yet they use the same mechanic. Why is Rhinos not included in the list for either of you?
Jerry and I have been pretty staunch with our hatred of Timur Rhinos from the beginning when it first started appearing in the metagame. And the answer is clear. You're jumping through the same hoop. As you mentioned, you're trying to get this Cascade card to resolve. In one case, you pretty much win the game. You take a card from your opponent's hand, destroy all their creatures, exile all their creatures, refresh the battlefield. And in another case, you get some 4/4 Rhinos. And those two things are not built the same, especially when it comes to the modern format. Now, that's a gross oversimplification, and I will admit that. I think Timur Rhinos does have some metagames where it's going to be a fine choice, particularly where those Rhinos are a threat that's hard to deal with, because you're so reliant on reliably getting those 4/4s into play, and honestly, multiple times. Like, the first Rhinos are never good enough. You have to just keep making Rhinos and keep making Rhinos and play this long, grindy game with no real power spike. I just don't understand what purpose the deck serves. That's my problem with it. I'm not sure what it does better than any other deck.
I mean, that's absolutely fair. And now, one question I do have. So both of these decks have some kind of interaction with the they do rely on the graveyard. Not necessarily entirely in the case of the Murktide deck, for example, but would you say you bring the same kind of hate for both of these? They are in the same slots, and that would be a pretty tidy answer. Do you bring graveyard hate for both of these, or is it different, very specific hate that you would bring, or ways to interact with these decks if you're expecting them?
It kind of depends on what your deck is trying to do. So if you're playing like Azorius Control, for example, your plan against Living End is either sit behind a wall of counter spells or get a hate card into play and protect it. And in that instance, against Living End, obviously you're going to bring in as many Rest in Pieces as you could possibly want. But against Is It Murktide, like, if you Rest in Peace them, yes, their Murktide Regents are very hard to cast, basically impossible, and their Dragon Rage's Channelers don't do a whole lot, but like, they still have Ragavan. They're still doing filtering stuff with DRC. They're going to board in things like Jace the Mind Sculptor. They might have Brazen Borrower to even just like remove the Rest in Peace for a turn, build up a graveyard, play a Murktide, or just kill you with the Brazen Borrower. So in that instance, I think it's more effective to generally just try to remove their threats on a 1-for-1 basis than to just try and go after their graveyard and think that that's going to solve all your problems, because it almost certainly isn't. So if you have the card, say, you're playing some white mid-range deck and you have a couple Rest in Pieces in your sideboard, maybe you bring them in against Murktide, but I think it's just a thing that maybe you're kind of happy to draw if you do have it, but it's not a thing that you lean on ever.
Yeah, it's a little too easy for Is It Murktide to find ways to sidestep that whole game plan. Like Gerry mentioned, they just have other options they'll go to. They're not reliant on the things that something like Rest in Peace is going to shut down. In the case of Living End, it asks a little more of you, and you can never fully shift away from that game plan. You can de-emphasize it, and you can have some things that are better suited to play a game where your graveyard may be under pressure, but it's always going to slow you down a bit when your opponent comes prepared. And I think that's the scenario where I'm trying to play those hard hate cards, things like Rest in Peace, and not only play them, but let them be a focal point of my plan. In the case of something like Is It Murktide, if you just think I'm going to mulligan to a Rest in Peace, stick it and be fine, that is not the case. They will be absolutely overjoyed in those scenarios and find a different way to kill you.
Ooh, and actually, this is a thing that I haven't really, updated my thought process with, but, Ledger Shredder just came out, and people are trying that in Is It Murktide too. Which I think is really good, because, Shredder into Bauble is just awesome. And that's another threat that just doesn't care about the graveyard, and they're playing a bunch of copies main deck in most instances. So,
yeah, great point.
Rest in Peace is looking worse and worse against them.
As a lot of people are saying, no matter how they interact with your graveyard, Ledger Shredder is still big even if you don't have a graveyard anymore.
Yep.
You just have it as a backup plan. As a side question, what are your thoughts on Ledger Shredder? Yay or nay, Ledger Shred?
Yay. Hard yay.
Yeah, I'm a yay as well. I started a little hesitant on the card, but I'm on board the more I see it in play. It's so important for a modern deck to be able to shift gears, to have sort of a curveball, and to do it with mana efficiency and contributing to the main game plan. Ledger Shredder just checks all of those boxes.
Yeah, that card was a bit of a sleeper. It went from being a 30-day price average, I think, 40 cents on Cardmarket to €8 in 2 days.
Yeah.
It skyrocketed. But now, enough of the lawyer board. We're going to get to the number one on our list. We're going to talk about this a lot because it's very important, and I'm personally kind of fed up with it. It kind of feels like Jund in the old Ravnica standard. What about 4-color midrange? You guys both agree it's number one, but why is it there?
It's so hard to kill. They just have infinite card advantage, infinite ways to interact with you. A lot of their cards also just deal with a wide variety of permanent types, and some of their stuff that they have as more so defensive tools, like Teferi Time Raveler, just incidentally also happens to be a hate card against the Cascade decks, and is really good against control decks too. Omnath insulates you against things like Burn, and can also provide a huge power spike, allowing you to get really ahead on a key turn. And now that they've upgraded their decks and figured out really, really good, powerful ways to build them, now they have this really compact, pretty powerful Risen Reef engine that can just allow them to draw their entire deck in the mid game. So there's no real downside to playing this deck. I don't like the fact that it's 80 cards, so playing in real life, dexterity is kind of annoying for me because I don't know, I'm used to shuffling 60 card decks, so that's kind of weird. And the games also take a long time, so that with all the fetches, all the shuffling, it being a big deck, I'm kind of hesitant to play it in a live tournament with 50-minute rounds, but I think that if I were playing in a big online tournament, there's no deck I would rather play, and it's just kind of infinitely customizable.
We've had a 2-year pandemic. We're not used to touching cards anymore, so the added 20 pile, our hands felt bigger before the pandemic, I feel somehow. Now, if you are expecting to face this deck if you go to a tournament, which you probably have to, because if someone's going to win, they are going to be playing this deck, what do you even bring to beat this?
You hope your opponent is too slow to finish their rounds in time. It's just so hard to get an edge over this deck. That's the real problem here, and that's the reason it's at the top of both of our lists. If you try to ignore them, they have answers. They play actual factual counterspell ready to go a lot of the times. Gerry mentioned incidental hate cards, things like Teferi Time Raveler. And then if they know what metagame to expect, what can't they do? They have access to so many cards in both number and just versatility, all the effects that span Modern. This deck can do absolutely everything, and I think it rewards just committing to it. So if you're asking me the best way to target it, I don't have an answer for you. My advice, start shuffling, getting used to holding those 80 cards, and register this deck at your next event.
I built it in real life. I've been practicing, but it's still just awkward.
So hard.
Shuffling the cards or learning to play the deck.
Yeah, exactly. Just the combination of everything involved. And then you're just fetching every turn too, and you have Ren and 6, so you're almost always making a fetch land drop, and you want to trigger your Omnath and everything, so it's just a lot of shuffling. Your kill's very slow. It's kind of a nightmare.
Okay, so outside of just needing really muscly hands to shuffle your own Omnath deck, you guys don't really have another suggestion as to what to bring. So I was going to go into a question. You guys kind of answered it, but maybe we have a twist. Say you were invited, Cardmarket invited you tomorrow to a tournament in Berlin, where if you win, you win, but if you lose, you die. Your life is on the line. What would you bring? You had one deck to bring. What would you bring with you?
I would first bemoan my bad luck, as any Magic player should do, right? That I have to play in this tournament. But, like I said, I'm not super confident in my ability to finish rounds with 4-color midrange. And this is from someone who has very few unintentional draws in their life, right? So, I think it's possibly Izzet Murktide, even though I don't really particularly like the card Counterspell in Modern. I think that it is much better when you're using it to defend threats than use it defensively, like in a blue-white control deck or even the 4-color mid-range decks. So it's hard for me to get behind a Counterspell deck. But starting with Ragavan or DRC is definitely the way to go. I think the Ledger Shredder update is very good, lets you get away from some of that graveyard stuff. And it's one of the few decks in the format that gets to play Blood Moon too, and I think that there are things like Amulet and even 4-color midrange where occasionally you can Blood Moon them and have it be good. So it's probably Izzet Murktide for me, honestly.
And what about you, Brian? Are you dying at this tournament, or do you have a strong pick?
Oh, I'm gonna die, Carl, but I'm gonna die the way I want to. I'm gonna go out like I came in. I'm registering straight up Boomer Jund. I'm talking Thoughtseize. I'm talking Dark Confidant. I'm talking
sorry,
Liliana
Brian.
of the Veil. I'm talking Bloodbraid Elf. And yes, that's probably it for me. But you know what? I'm going to go out with a smile on my face, casting those cards I love. And
we'll be discarding cards at your funeral.
You had a good run, Brian, you know?
Look, no complaints, no regrets. Me and Tarmogoyf were just riding into the sunset and calling it a good run.
Chef's kiss, beautiful. Listen, thank you for your input on the Modern format. I hope anyone watching has learned a lot and kind of knows what to come prepared or what to buy for their upcoming tournaments. And if you're not subbed yet and you're watching this for the first time, you came in maybe because you saw Gerry or Brian on the thumbnail, please, if you're not subbed, we really rely on the subs to grow the channel. We're so close to 20K. Who knows? Maybe if you sub, we'll make Raccoons a viable deck in Modern. You don't know if we're not in charge of that unless you press sub. So what do you have to lose? But in the meantime, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Gerry, for coming. And we'll wish you a great day. We'll see you in the next video.